From David Zwirner, this is Dialogues, a podcast about artists and the way they think.
To make something that is lasting, something that survives the terrible happenings of the day. Look around you and see what is surviving through the centuries. It is the beautiful things, and it is not wars.
I'm Helen Molesworth, your host for this season. Every episode features a conversation with artists, curators, writers, designers, philosophers, filmmakers, and musicians about what it means to make things today. Hey everybody, it's Helen. I am so happy to be back on the feed to host a new season of Dialogues. We're starting it off with a very special episode about one of the most important abstract artists of the 20th century, Anni Albers. I'm joined by two fabulous artists and weavers, Diedrick Brackens and Kirstine Woods, as well as the art historian Julia Bryan-Wilson, to discuss Anni Albers' work, her writing and teaching, and her philosophy of weaving. This episode is a real treat as it features rare archival audio of Anni Albers. And for those of you in New York, the new exhibition featuring Anni Albers, Josef Albers, and Paul Klee opens this week at our 20th Street Gallery. It was curated by Nick Fox-Weber, the director of the Josef and Anni Albers Foundation. The show will be on view through April 19th. I really hope you enjoy the podcast and the show. Anni Albers was born Anneliese Fleischmann in 1899 in Berlin, Germany. She died 95 years later, having lived through much of the 20th century in suburban Connecticut. She was raised in a comfortable bourgeois family. Her father owned a furniture-making company, and her mother's family was involved in publishing. And like many affluent and assimilated German Jews, her family had converted to Christianity. Ultimately, Albers would become known as a master weaver, a gifted and subtle writer, and an artist who blurred the lines between art and craft. But her route to this vaulted position was a slow one. Here she is from a 1985 interview with Richard Polsky, describing her tentative steps towards art.
Well, I mean, when you graduated from, let's say, high school, or what would be the equivalent of high school, and you said to your parents, I'd like to be a painter.
No, oh no. It wasn't that clear at all. I would like to go to school to learn something about drawing, painting, and so on. But it never occurred to me to aim at art, you know. In fact, the word career that is always used by all the young ones doesn't exist in my vocabulary. Neither in Joseph's ever did.
She's a little hard to hear in that clip. She said she was trying to, quote, aim at art, and that the word career didn't exist in her vocabulary. This is kind of remarkable given that Albers was deeply involved in two of the 20th century's most important art schools, the Bauhaus in Germany and Black Mountain College in the United States, schools that continue to shape our contemporary ideas about art and art teaching. Nevertheless, Albers decided to, quote, aim at art by heading off to art school herself. Here she is describing her entrance into the Bauhaus, Germany's premier art academy.
I was at that time interested in painting, and I felt that the tremendous freedom of the painter was scaring me. And I was looking for some way to find my way a little more securely. I didn't know how. Yeah. And when I got to the Bauhaus, I found that every student who entered there had first to go through a preliminary course and then choose one of the workshops. And I wasn't at all interested in these workshops, really, because the metal workshop I felt was painful to the hands. The woodworking shop was so terribly hard, lifting lumber and so on. the wall painting, I couldn't stand the ideas. So the only thing that was open to me was a weaving workshop. And I thought that was rather sissy.
Given the fact that joining the weaving workshop changed our understanding of weaving, I asked art historian Julia Bryan-Wilson what she thought when she heard this account of how Anni Albers ended up as a weaver.
Let me start by saying it's a bit disingenuous, this idea that she was kind of scared away because of the idea of kind of like physical discomfort from other workshops. She was not allowed as a woman into the other workshops. Walter Gropius, who was the founder of the Bauhaus, opened this radical art and design school in 1919 with the idea that it would have like gender equivalence. By 1922, he felt he was being overwhelmed by women. And he started to put into place measures to keep women from, for example, glass and metal. So she actually didn't have a choice there. And it wasn't just because she worried that it would hurt her hand. You know, she was excluded from those other mediums and forced into weaving because of sexism.
I couldn't help but flag Albers' use of the word sissy, and neither could Julia.
Well, I did a little etymological work, and I mean, it meant then what it means now, which is like effeminate, you know, it's queer coded. There's a homosexual tinge to it. It means immature. It's heavily gendered. And I think it's fascinating that she uses that word. And to think, to put that into our context now of 2024 and think about how many queer weavers are embracing the sissification of the material. I feel like it's almost this gem for those of us who are interested in thinking about kind of queer craft, that she really, she's naming it.
The last 2 decades have seen a rise in practices traditionally associated with craft being taught in art schools. For instance, artist Kirstine Woods has taught fiber for over 2 decades at the Maryland Institute College of Art, and the word sissy caught her ear too.
It's my understanding that, in fact, if you were gendered as a woman and you went to the Bauhaus, you only could work in the weaving workshop. So she says she thought of it as sissy. It could be understood that it was a kind of ghetto, right? If that's a place where people, with a shared, like who hold something in common, end up together in the weaving workshop. So it may be very fraught for her.
And it turns out that some things, like gendered ghettos, don't really change that much. Listen as artist Diedrick Brackens describes his first experience of being in a weaving class.
Like, certainly when I first started weaving, knowing it would be my preoccupation for the rest of my life, I was like, I was keenly aware of like how weaving was seen. Like, what is this? I'm like, I make art with string. And so, yeah, I definitely felt like, and I was one male in a program, probably of 40 women. So like all of my classmates were women. And so like, I never, felt strangely about it inside of it, but I could sort of see outside of myself how the world sort of like perceived and thought about it. But I never found it personally limiting. Like, I was always so excited.
While Albers might have felt ambivalence at the beginning of her Bauhaus experience, it would nevertheless change the trajectory of her life. And like Diedrick, weaving provided many different encounters for her, one of which was with the discipline of teaching.
What made it exciting to be at the Bauhaus was that there was no system of teaching yet at that time, and that you felt that you were completely on your own, and that you had somehow to find your way of functioning. But there was nothing really to go by, no set direction of any kind. And I think this vacuum is something very important probably for every student to experience, so that he can start finding himself possibly.
Albers could have no idea the degree to which her early feelings of, quote, being on your own or being in a vacuum would actually come to pass. In 1933, the Nazis insisted the Bauhaus accept teachers affiliated with the Nazi Party. Instead of accommodating this order, the leaders of the Bauhaus made the difficult decision to close the school. And despite her parents' assimilation, Anni Albers' Jewishness was about to become a problem, as was her husband Josef Albers' association with what the Nazis called degenerate art. Like many artists, intellectuals, and Jewish people, they knew it was time to leave. With the help of a then little-known curator at MoMA, Philip Johnson, the Albers found themselves on a boat to the United States, having secured a teaching position for Josef at the fledgling Black Mountain College in Asheville, North Carolina.
And I want to put in something about our arrival on the Europa, on that first trip to America. And that was that we arrived late at night in the dark through that delay of the storm. And so we never saw the Statue of Liberty. But I wanted to say something about that because years later, when we went to Italy and arrived by boat again in New York, there was a Statue of Liberty and she was waving at us. And Josef and I were both very touched by seeing this lady welcoming us back. In fact, we both had tears in our eyes, feeling that she greeted us, and we felt, and I felt that there must be some place for figurative art or representational art, because I don't think an abstract form, an obelisk or any monument of that kind would have evoked this feeling of homecoming that we felt at that point.
When the Albers first arrived in New York under cover of night, they missed Lady Liberty in the harbor. But America, as a beacon of democracy, prevailed upon them and their thinking. Once they arrived at Black Mountain, they joined a ragtag group of teachers and students who were determined to start a new school based on John Dewey's philosophy of learning through doing. Neither Josef nor Anni Albers thought of Black Mountain as an art school, though. Here, they were interested in how they might deploy Dewey's philosophy of learning through doing to teach young people the art of thinking critically. Given the rise of global fascism, the experiment was, could you teach people how to be better citizens by teaching them the principles of being an artist? As the war dragged on, the Albers worked to secure many teaching positions at Black Mountain for other persecuted German and Austrian Jews. At first, Anni Albers didn't teach. Instead, she translated for Josef and wrote the promotional materials for the college. But as things at the college began to gel, Albers got to work establishing a weaving workshop. It's important to remember that Black Mountain opened in 1933, height of the Great Depression. And then, throughout the 1940s, it weathered the rationing of World War II. This ongoing scarcity informed Anni Albers' teaching.
Yes, I liked to teach, and I developed a certain way of approach which I thought turned into quite an exciting experience for my students also. Because what I did was I made them imagine that no materials existed and that we were in Peru at the coast, at the desert coast. And there we were in the sand with the sun over us and some wind and the water with marvelous fish quite near. And what were some of the things that we did? So you put not strings, vines together, or cut some fish up into strips of some made a flexible material. The skin of the fish you cut into strips probably and tried to attach them to each other with knots, and you made some open knots which turned into a net, which turned out to be a marvelous carrying case also.
I wondered what Kristine, a dedicated teacher, thought when she heard Albers discuss this kind of quasi-primitivist idea of starting at zero.
We're talking about this kind of back to zero proposal that she made in the pedagogic environment, where she would encourage students to think back, to like, oh, what if you're, in the desert in Peru and you have no clothes? I mean, when we first read that, it's kind of horrifying on the page. But the spirit of it, which is that all of us contain the inventiveness to make something where there is nothing, that all of us can imagine a technology that, it wasn't here yesterday and now it's here. I mean, that is such a profound gift to a student.
I asked, what might it be about weaving in particular that creates the desire to start from the ground up? Kristine had a really evocative response.
The discipline of weaving is kind of like magic to a lot of people. I mean, this is a podcast, so we can't see what I'm doing, but like we all have fingers and we've all interlaced our fingers together. We have a fundamental understanding of the of making a container, right? And so I think that it's the availability, the accessibility of weaving. I mean, also that that people all over the world did it. It's amazing.
I agree. It is amazing. Unlike oil painting, with its exclusively Western European origin, weaving happens globally in almost every culture and during every time period of human history. Here's Julia Bryan-Wilson on Albers' pedagogical approach.
To me, this is both primitivizing and a kind of nostalgia for a noble savage who's, inventing things from scratch, and it's probably pretty inventive pedagogy. I think it's both at once. And I think, of course, what the thought experiment leaves out is the idea that weaving is embedded in centuries of matrilineal training. And, that all these communities, I mean, the loom is this centerpiece, even for nomadic communities. The loom is an object itself of learning and training. And that you would have, that no one's naked in the desert with nothing, having to come up from scratch with these techniques. They are like being born into these techniques. They're learning from their mothers and their aunts and their grandmothers, etc.
While Albers almost never situated weaving within the sphere of women as such, or the matrilineal specifically, she did see it as a trans-historical activity. Her respect for ancient weavers was so profound that she opened her 1965 book on weaving with the following sentence: "Dedicated to my great teachers, the weavers of ancient Peru." And now, here she is describing the next developments in her Black Mountain classes.
Gradually, we then invented looms, out of sticks and so on, and the Peruvian backstrap loom. And once they understand these basic elements that the Peruvian backstrap loom have, embedded in it is anything that a high-power machine loom today has.
I'm really struck by how Albers extols the technological sophistication of the Andean weavers, and I think she does so underneath the long shadow of World War II. While she and Josef were at Black Mountain College, they made numerous trips to Mexico, where she was exposed to several pre-colonial contact cultures. During this time, she began to collect clay artifacts and textiles, and she ultimately donated that collection to the Peabody Museum at Yale University. Anni Albers knew all too well that fetishizing technological progress or thinking European culture was superior could and did lead to ruin. After witnessing and experiencing the devastation of the war, she maintained her commitment to art's greatest promise, its longevity.
This perhaps goes back to my work in weaving, which also builds from parts. To make something that is lasting, something that survives the terrible happenings of the day. Look around you and see what is surviving through the centuries. It is the beautiful things, and it is not wars.
Albers rarely mentions war or her status as an expat, and she never mentioned the ongoing sexism that perpetually trailed behind her. In 1948, she and Josef left Black Mountain for New Haven, so Josef could lead the art school at Yale University. And Anni Albers, even though she had established the weaving workshop at Black Mountain College, was not allowed to teach at Yale, because Yale only had male faculty until 1961. She wasn't even permitted to eat in the faculty club, which was men only until 1969. That is a full 3 years after I was born. Given Albers' central role in the history of 20th century weaving, it was obviously Yale's loss, and a super grave loss for generations of students. But Albers would not be deterred. While in New Haven, she was extremely busy.
Of course, it's also important to know that Albers was, hugely famous in her own time. She was the first textile artist to have a solo show at the Museum of Modern Art. That was in 1949. That is a show that traveled to over 20 different other venues. So I just also want to recognize that this is not someone who has, who kind of only belatedly came into her fame. She was enormously influential in her own moment.
Here's Albers talking about the MoMA show. I couldn't help but notice how she deflects the attention away from herself and focuses primarily on the exhibition's young curator, Philip Johnson.
And he was at that time involved with the design department at the Modern Art. And he saw some of my things in Black Mountain because Josef had asked him to come and lecture or something of the kind. And he said, wouldn't you like to show your things at the Museum of Modern Art? Well, sure, yes. And he had at that time some power over there, long lost now. And it turned out that the museum was ready to do that. They gave me a small room there on the main floor.
Yeah.
And I was the only textile person they had ever shown, and I was the only one-man show they was of a living person. And so, and at that time, Philip Johnson wasn't well known yet. Mm-hmm. I don't have to explain him to you.
No.
And I was very happy with the way he took on my exhibition, the exhibition idea. He hung my things, and I was very impressed the way he started this exhibition. He put on first the lights where he wanted the lighting to go, and that impressed me very much. He was very thoughtful about that.
In addition to being the first living textile artist to be given a one-person show at MoMA, Anni Albers was also so influential that she was asked to write the entry on weaving for the Encyclopedia Britannica. And perhaps even more importantly for artists and thinkers, she also wrote On Weaving. First published in 1965, it contains short, plain-spoken essays on the form, materials, and processes of weaving. It was here that Albers would establish, in no uncertain terms, weaving as a trans-historical form of making. Here is the book's opening paragraph. One of the most ancient crafts, hand weaving is a method of forming a pliable plane of threads by interlacing them rectangularly. Invented in a pre-ceramic age, it has remained essentially unchanged to this day. Even the final mechanization of the craft, through the introduction of power machinery, has not changed the basic principle of weaving. So on-weaving begins by first paying attention to the loom, particularly preparing or dressing the loom, as it's referred to. Here are both Kristine and Diedrick on this essential activity.
And also, I have also taught many other people to dress the loom, and it is the rare first encounter weaver who finds it anything less than perilous. And the kind of loom that I have dressed and am most familiar with is it's a jack loom or a floor loom, a loom that sits on the floor and comes down through a legacy of European weaving. So this would be different from, for example, a backstrap loom, which is used widely in vast parts of the world and is more attached to the body. So dressing the loom requires the management of, in some cases, hundreds or even thousands of threads or pieces of string. And you have to measure them out on a kind of mechanism for winding, which is called, you wind the warp. The warp are the threads that go onto the loom first. They are like the page that then the weft is woven into. The warp is the beginning. So organizing the warp threads is exceedingly important. If you cross even 2 threads, you will not be able to weave the cloth according to your plan.
As Kristine went on to describe the increasingly arduous nature of dressing the loom, I began to feel just how perilous this situation could be.
All of those threads need to be held in order. This involves all of these various different kinds of tensioning knots, and you learn those as you go along. And then they need to be threaded through the heddles. And the heddles are just like hundreds of eyes that are looking at you, suspended in the loom, and each one of those eyes receives a thread. And then there are many, many other steps that follow that involve pulling the warp through the loom and then finally tying it on. Only then can you really start weaving.
Given the degree of complexity before the weaving even begins, perhaps it's no mistake that Diedrick Brackens sees the loom itself as a collaborator in the process.
I think the loom is alive. I think the loom is as much an actor as it is an object. I think there's kind of like as much as I'm pressing on the machine and inserting myself.
The first chapters in On Weaving are about the loom, the device that lends weaving its form. They are subsequently followed by chapters dedicated to materials, in which Albers insists that an artist's intimate understanding of her materials is essential to the process of making. Here she is being interviewed in 1968 by Sevim Feshi for the Smithsonian Archives of American Art.
But would you say so that an artist needs some discipline?
Yes, so, very much so. And I find that this a craft is giving somebody who is trying to find his way a kind of discipline. At the Renaissance, they had to grind their paints, they had to prepare their canvas or wood panels, and they were very limited, really, in the handling of the material. While today you buy in any paint store the paint and squeeze it, and the panels come ready-made, and there is nothing that teaches you the care that a material demands. The material, yes, that's it. I mean, when you have to prepare the material, the painter or the weaver or so on, you learn what the material tells you and what the technique
Both
tells
Kristine
you.
and Diedrick had surprising things to say about materials.
I work a lot with wool, and I have been around sheep. I spent 2 months in Iceland during the season, right, where you bring the sheep down from the highlands and, you have to corral them, and, small children are carrying little lambs, all, it's greasy and it's messy and there's shit everywhere. And I love that because that's such an insight into what is wool. It comes from an animal, like it's something from another body that I use in my work without permission. There's so much insight into what the material does.
If, for Kristine, wool as a material remains connected to the historical entanglements between humans and animals, for Diedrick, materials are suffused with human history.
What does it mean to think through and with materials? I think for me, it's this thing that has become buried in my practice, but I definitely think I'm always curious to know why other artists use the materials that they do. Like because it's not given, I imagine, like we all could choose to work with whatever. And so for me, it is important that like I spend time looking at the material and thinking about like what is the story embedded in this material? Like what does it mean? Where did it come from? How did it get there? Why am I using it? And I have this very particular relationship with cotton that I have thought a lot about how it came to be where it is and what my relationship is to it, what its relationship is to a larger world. And, and insisting on using that material because of, all that it is grounded in. And I think that it already does a lot of work of speaking or messaging out something that then gets couched in the practice, like that I don't have to sort of put into an artist statement every time I have a show.
Right. And not to be too pedantic, but I'm assuming we're talking about the fact that cotton is central to the transatlantic slave trade.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you use cotton exclusively? So you don't use wool or silk because you're interested in the what that material is carrying.
Yes. So primarily the work is composed of cotton. There is no other sort of natural, quote unquote, fiber in my practice. But, I will use acrylic yarn and these other things that I think then have this relationship to painting, have a relationship to like all the other things that we've extracted out of this planet that we probably should have left where they were.
If one of the effects of on weaving was to establish weaving as a discipline and a practice, then it left Albers having to contend with the Western notion of capital A art. Was weaving a craft or was it art? As we heard earlier in the program, today's fiber artists are reevaluating these terms. I asked Julia about the place Albers holds in this history.
This is a fascinating question about the role of weaving and importance of Anni Albers to histories of 20th century art. I would say that for many decades, she was overlooked and somewhat excluded, as was the procedure of weaving and other textile making forms.
I agree with you. The contestation, I feel like we're winning. I feel like there's a whole rethinking of the terms, whether the term woman, feminine, craft, functional, decorative, all of these things. I do wonder, though, is there anything particular about weaving that you think is important to how you might frame various histories of the 20th century?
Because of its interface between the horizontal and the vertical, we are talking ultimately about the grid, and the grid as the kind of lodestone of 20th century modernism. These histories are so interlaced. They're so interwoven. I mean, this is what Lynn Cook's show, Woven Abstraction, is really probing, is the idea that the grid as an autonomous form on a canvas, which has been returned to again and again in histories of avant-garde painting, is also, of course, a history of the weave And in Rosalind Krauss's really famous, rightfully famous essay about grids, she actually does say that part of why the grid is this kind of inescapable paradigm that artists return to obsessively again and again, because the canvas is haunted by the structure of the underlying canvas support, which is woven.
The grid is fundamental to weaving. Every piece of woven cloth has a warp. Those are the threads that go up and down vertically, and a weft, the thread that moves from side to side or horizontally. The grid is, of course, also fundamental to painting, be it in the structure of the canvas, the development of single-point perspective, or the evolution of modernist abstraction. And yet, as Anni Albers summed up her life's work, her ambivalence about capital A art was clear.
So I have been working in these three areas, utilitarian fabrics and teaching and the things in the direction of art.
Yeah.
I have to say, I'm just so moved by her phrase, things in the direction of art. Not quite art, but not art either. This makes sense to me. I mean, it's partly due to what I think is Albers' inherent modesty, but it's also because weaving by definition is a fluid form that moves across boundaries. There are the decorative tapestries that grace the walls of Renaissance chateaux, and then there's the functional twill of everyday work clothing. The pliable planes of weaving are nothing if not transgressive boundary crossers. I asked Julia Bryan-Wilson what it means to make something, quote, in the direction of art.
What she says, it goes in the direction of art. So that's kind of interesting hedging there on her part. I think she's really keen in that moment to take textiles off of the wall or off of the floor. You know, she doesn't want it to be seen as tapestry. She doesn't want it to be seen as rug. So it's hanging in the middle of the space. There is this interesting translucency, and she's using all these interestingly heterodox materials, like everything from jute to cotton to cellophane. So there's also a mixture of the industrial and the natural in these. So they're scrambling categories in all kinds of ways.
This scrambling of categories is also something Diedrick alluded to.
To me, all woven cloth is quite sculptural, even when flat. And it's something maybe to do with the process. Like there's something about weaving, the kind of up and down, and you're sort of working on these, the X and the Y axis, but when the warp and the weft kind of collide, there's this other dimension that you get to inhabit, I think, as the maker. Like the loom becomes a vehicle. Like inside of this thing, I feel all the sculptural possibility.
This sense of possibility, so productive for Diedrick and Kristine, were not always rewarded when it came to Anni.
And nobody cared much for the weaving then. And also I tried to push it toward art and did not succeed in getting it into galleries or museums or so. It was always design, and design always means needlework or knitting or so. When I finally turned toward graphic, it was a great relief because it freed you from horizontal vertical, which is always weaving and which is, I believe in limitations as very productive in a way. But there was always this problem that in weaving in these single pieces, which became my main interest, that they took so long and you had only one piece.
Yes.
While in graphics you had editions.
Yes. Right.
And it was no problem anymore to show them in galleries or museums. And as I always say, when it's on paper,
Now,
it's
by
art.
graphics here, she means her turn to printmaking, which basically means she's saying, when it's on paper, it's art. And that's funny because it's true. In the mid-1960s, Albers made beguiling prints of knotted and tangled threads, images that speak to her deep knowledge of materials and the metaphors that accompany them. And around that time, she offered another definition of art.
Well, I have this very, what you call today, square idea that art is something that makes you breathe with a different kind of happiness.
I confess this definition really surprised me. I thought she would talk about form or process, but instead she's talking about breathing and happiness. It surprised Kristine, too. Do you sense a connection between weaving and breath or breathing?
Weaving is close to the body. There is always, in any loom configuration, the necessity to separate the warp threads from each other, to open every other thread or every third thread up and down, like a kind of opening up of the lungs or opening of the mouth. And then you put something else in there and then close it again. And it's that, and then you open it in another orientation and put something else in there. So it is a constant, kind of opening and closing and accepting in new materials. So there is that kind of repetition of breathing or breath.
Julia Bryan-Wilson also intuited the strong connection between breathing and weaving. What do you think she means when she says breathe? Like, do you sense that there's a connection between weaving and breath or weaving and breathing for Albers?
Yeah. To me, that phrase about how she defines art as something that where you can breathe with more happiness it is lovely. I find it is a little sentimental. It wouldn't be my go-to definition about art, which has more to do for myself with kind of putting ideas into circulation, and those ideas can take many shapes. But it is I don't have anything against it. It made me smile when I heard it. And I do think there's a very profound connection between weaving and breathing, especially for Albers, given her profound attachment to backstrap loom weaving, because the backstrap loom, which was the primary form of weaving in pre-contact Andean Peru, which is where she, where she felt that she had her greatest teachings, is connected to the body. And in fact, the loom is attached to your waist. And so there's all this torsion that you can do by leaning forward, leaning back. The tautness of the warp is contingent upon these minute movements of the body. And so actually, as you breathe, because it's like when you fill your lungs or your rib cage expands, there are these kind of calibrations that are happening with the threads. So to me, there's something to be said about the relationship there.
And here we are again with the indigenous weavers of the Andes, an image of weaving that emerges whenever we talk about Anni Albers. And yet, despite our own marvelous technological advances, weaving persists. Indeed, in the contemporary art world, weaving has grown and expanded. I asked Diedrick explicitly, just what was it about weaving that made it so available in our current moment?
I think I grew up on the kind of digital analog break. And so there was something for me really exciting about going to a place and concentrating on a thing and perfecting my abilities and sensitivities to the world. And I think every time I encounter a student who is really into weaving, there is something for them where they want a tactile relationship to themselves, to the world, a sensitivity that I don't think you're getting with your phone. And I think they want to mentally go somewhere. They're like, you don't when you're staring down into your phone. But I do think that there's a thirst for a relationship to process and material that folks have not established in any other way. So I think it is clear to me that there's kind of at a mental, emotional, physical, like kind of connection that's happening for people in a way that they have not unlocked before when they weave.
Late in Anni Albers' life, folks came calling to talk to her about her extraordinary legacy. Here she is answering questions about what she thought her contributions were.
In your own work, what do you feel has been the most your strongest contribution to the field of weaving, really?
That's perhaps not for me to say, but what I'm known for is that my experimental side, with different materials that hadn't been used, and also that I was very interested in construction side and made, for instance, what is always quoted and what I always deny, that I made these Drehergewebe, no, what's the English word? With twisted threads, a transparent kind of material. How are they called?
Allows the light to...
Lino weave. And I say, you're quite wrong. This was done already 3,000 years ago. It's true, there are early Peruvian weavings who have that. But still, there is sometimes a great need to have heroes. And I was lucky to be thought in some way as one of the lights at one point.
It's true. Sometimes we do need heroes. And we are lucky to get one as groundbreaking and generous and modest as Anni Albers. Thanks so much for listening. And thanks as well to our interlocutors, Diedrick Brackens, Julia Bryan-Wilson, and Kristine Woods. Thank you to the amazing Archive of American Art at the Smithsonian Institute and Columbia University Libraries for their treasure trove of oral histories. And a special thanks to Nicholas Fox Weber and the Josef and Anni Albers Foundation for their ongoing support of the scholarship and appreciation of the work of Anni Albers. Dialogues is produced by David Zwirner. If you like this episode, please follow, rate, and review us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. It really does help the show. Thanks so much for tuning in. I hope you join us here next time.